These wild landscapes once stretched from coast to coast. Some of them still exist because more than any other nation, America has sought to preserve remnants of the world as it once was. In the 1960s and 70s, Idaho was a leader in protecting these special places, like the Selway River in north-central Idaho, and the soaring peaks and pristine lakes of the Sawtooth Mountains.
Designated wilderness is unique to America. We are the only nation that has designated wilderness. We say that we now value nature as it is, that nature has an inherent value to it that is separate from any economic value we place on that area.
There was a religious fervor to many of those early wilderness advocates, and they set limits on what we humans should do. Hiking, yes, by all means. Horseback, you bet. But no motors. Leave the mechanical devices at the edge. Translating such purity into law was, however, not always possible. Sometimes, to secure wilderness protection, it meant grandfathering in primitive airstrips, or allowing jet boat traffic on certain sections of the Salmon River. But folks thought it was worth the trade-off, if only to protect vital watersheds, give wildlife a place to thrive, and provide a spiritual antidote for the ills of modern society. So, what have we learned in the 50 years since the passage of the Wilderness Act?
We get carried away with trying to put our values on a landscape, and I think that's the wrong thing to do. I think you have to take wilderness on its own terms. Wilderness is about what happens to the land when we step back and appreciate it and try to learn from it.
If the wilderness, that movement is going to prevail and stay with us, it needs broad public support. And part of that is the public has got to be able to use it.
But 50 years ago, the wilderness movement did not anticipate the popularity of mountain bikes, which, because they are mechanized, are not allowed in wilderness areas. And this has led a younger generation to seek alternatives to wilderness.
Being able to designate monument status as opposed to wilderness, it gives you a lot more flexibility, and that's what you're seeing in the Boulder White Clouds.
And 50 years ago, wilderness advocates did not anticipate climatic conditions that bring devastating wildfires and an infestation of weeds. This has led some to call for a mix of human intervention and wild nature. Not exactly the traditional view of wilderness. In our most far-reaching production yet, Outdoor Idaho visits each of Idaho's wilderness areas.
Long way down.
50 years after the passage of the Wilderness Act, how are we doing? What, if anything, needs to change? It's been called an American invention, this concept of wilderness. In that respect, it's similar to another American invention, the national park. America setting aside the best of what defines us as a nation. In the 50s and 60s, Americans realized that wild, undeveloped landscapes were disappearing at an alarming rate, and that soon every nook and cranny on the continent could be touched by human endeavor. For some, the solution was something called designated wilderness, essentially taking public land out of the hands of federal agencies like the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management, and protecting it by an act of Congress signed by the President.
To endure the political winds was going to take an act of Congress to set this up and not leave it just to the agencies to manage. And the whole emphasis behind the Wilderness Act was that leaving it to agency flexibility wasn't going to cut it. They didn't like it. They were opposed to wilderness right up till the bitter end. I would argue they saw the inevitability of it.
It took more than 60 rewrites and 18 public hearings stretching over 9 years, and lots of compromise to hammer out an acceptable wilderness bill. It also took the leadership of Idaho Senator Frank Church to shepherd the bill through the U.S. Senate. But finally, in September of 1964, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Wilderness Act into law. At the heart of the legislation was this one sentence, describing wilderness as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. By the stroke of a pen, 9 million acres of wild land entered the National Wilderness Preservation System. We should be guardians, not gardeners, explained the drafter of the bill, Howard Zahniser. Among that first group of wilderness areas in 1964, the largest was in Idaho, called the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness. It stretches west from the lofty peaks along the Idaho-Montana border and north toward Highway 12. It's a rugged landscape encompassing huge stands of old-growth forests, imposing granite ridges and countless creeks and streams. Most of those rushing waters flow into the river at the heart of this wilderness, the Selway. This river was one of the 8 original waterways protected by the 1968 Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. And here at the Paradise launch site, whitewater rafters can begin a trip that takes them down nearly 50 miles of this wild river.
It's important for people from all walks of life to experience a true wilderness environment and just the opportunity for the camaraderie of the river.
Ken Masoner has been experiencing that camaraderie on this river for more than 40 years. His father, Elwood, was one of the first outfitters to get a permit to run the Selway, and that was in the early days of rafting this river back in 1971.
We had to learn how to run all of these rapids. There were not maps, of course. We helped to make the maps. I think the Forest Service has done a really good job and been on top of this because they recognize this as being the precious jewel of all of the wild and scenic rivers.
And to help keep the Selway pristine, the Forest Service only allows 1 launch a day during the rafting season.
I always liked the fact that only 1 trip went a day.
Lead guide Dennis Jesse has been taking groups down the Selway for 2 decades.
I don't think it's for everybody, but I think everyone should get a taste of it and understand, okay, civilization versus wilderness, there is a big difference. You're on your own out here, and you got to be really self-sufficient. I really think that's what makes it true wilderness.
Thousands of rafters apply for permits to raft the Selway Wilderness. But with only 60 private launch dates and 16 commercial trips, a small percentage of boaters actually get on the river.
With only 1 launch a day, we typically don't see anybody. There's a group a day ahead of you, there's a group a day behind you. You have the river to yourself for 5 days. You often won't see anybody else out here. It's the most sought after guiding job in the state, I would say. It is class 4 at higher water, you know, it's pushing 4 plus, class 5. It's, I'd say, a half a notch harder than the Middle Fork, and it has a steeper gradient. It's about 28 feet a mile.
Guests find their way to the Selway from all over the world. On this trip, the group includes a California couple and a family from Arkansas.
I like to go to places that not many people visit and places that you get to see and do things that are really special. This is something I really felt was important for my family that will last for a long time in their minds, and something that's epic. And that's what we have done here.
The trip really gets epic at the midway point when the waters of Moose Creek nearly double the size of the Selway. The turbulent stretch below is known as Moose Juice, and it includes one of the state's most famous rapids.
Ladle is a rapid that a lot of trips have ended on for people. Ladle is a boulder field, and it changes quite a bit, so you're always scouting Ladle. In high water, it's a lot of pour-overs, really dangerous hydraulics, really confusing to find a line in. It is a puzzle. Most people that first see it are like, what? Where do we go? How do we do this? And that entry is probably the most critical thing, getting in the right spot to start. And then you drop in, and plan A might become plan B really quickly. Bump one rock and your line changed. And there are not a lot of options down in there. You want to get through all the rocks above and then straighten out for the big hole at the bottom. That's where every guide wants to be, down there looking up. It's so much more fun from that angle.
Of course, there are more rapids downriver, and none bigger than Wolf Creek.
Wolf Creek is fast and furious. It just chokes up to probably a quarter of the width that it was up above the rapid and gathers speed quickly. After the first drop, all you're thinking about at this point is not hitting Elwood's Rock at the bottom and flipping.
I like that it has a lot more class 4s because they're a lot of fun, and like at one day we did 10 rapids and 10 level 4 rapids in one day.
While the Selway is full of rapids, the calmer sections, camps, and side trips off the river give rafters time for reflection.
As I get older, I realize there's a lot of things I won't be able to do that I used to, but it's important to know those places still exist. The Selway is a very special place. It's important to preserve this.
It's just the beauty of nature. It's the amazing creations that are around us that we can see. And it's fun to watch the kids have fun and laugh and smile and show them that there's more than city life and the everyday anxieties that are out there.
When I first come to this river, it got in my blood, and this river is almost like an artery in my life, you know, to my soul, my body. It keeps me going. I haven't experienced a lot of other places, but this is heaven to me. And that's kind of all I need to know. Forever, this will be my home.
The Selway Bitterroot Wilderness is large, 1.3 million acres. But there is an even larger wilderness to the south of it, one that encompasses much of the River of No Return, as well as its famous tributary, the Middle Fork of the Salmon. Its boundaries reflected the desire to protect water quality and habitat for salmon and steelhead, and habitat for bighorn sheep and mountain goats as well. To ecologists, the beauty of these large areas is that natural processes can play out on a grand scale, even when that's not a comfortable thing to watch. Today, many of us think of the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness as an indispensable part of the Idaho story. But dig a little deeper and you'll discover that it was incredibly controversial, and one of the reasons Frank Church lost his seat in the U.S. Senate in 1980. In fact, Church was the only one of the Idaho delegation to vote for the River of No Return Wilderness Bill. After all, this is more than 2.3 million acres. And for the most part, critics contend, it is locked up. But the Forest Service does manage the 10,000 people who each year float the 100 miles of the Middle Fork of the Salmon. And it is possible to jet boat up part of the main Salmon River, or fly into some of the tiny airstrips scattered throughout the forest. But out here, it's pretty much a hands-off philosophy. One of those called upon to oversee the Frank, as it's come to be called, was Earl Dodds. He served as the Big Creek District Ranger from 1958 until his retirement in 1984. He remembers the change from Forest Service primitive area to congressionally designated wilderness.
One of the things we started on was a program of pack it in, pack it out. And that was kind of a radical change here.
That's because just about everyone, including outfitters and the Forest Service, buried their garbage in the woods. Today, pack it in, pack it out is standard operating procedure.
I'm really kind of proud of the American public and the way they have changed their ways here.
Another thing that changed, no power equipment.
That was one of the first things we did, get rid of our own power equipment, our own power saws and lawnmowers and generators to set the example, and it wasn't easy. We wrote quite a few violations for the use of power saws before we got that job done.
But perhaps the biggest change with Wilderness was how wildfires were now allowed to burn. At first, this was hard for Earl Dodds to accept. But today, he and most Forest Service officials do accept the role of fire as a management tool. In fact, the chief of the U.S. Forest Service, Tom Tidwell, believes we need to use even more fire.
Fire is part of the ecosystem, and it is the only tool we have to be able to restore the health and resiliency of these systems. And luckily, like here in Idaho and the Frank Church and also in the Selway Bitterroot, we've seen the difference by being able to manage natural fires. So today when we get a large fire started, yes, it burns, but it'll burn into one of the old burns. It slows down, it creeps across there, and we're able then to have fire in the system to help promote the overall health.
Each year, hundreds of backpackers hike into the Frank Church Wilderness and witness firsthand the effects of large wildfires. But almost none of them will hike the full width of this wilderness, a distance of more than 50 miles with significant elevation gain. And almost none of them will start at Big Creek.
Well, I've had this trip in my mind for probably almost 2 decades. A lot of people understand the Frank by their visits via the Middle Fork of the Salmon, but very few people understand or can appreciate the Frank, me included. The way I did it could be best described as nutty, to look at the Frank much in the same way that the prevailing winds and the prevailing weather systems approach the Frank. This trip, I don't think could have been done 5 years ago with the kind of video gear that we have. So we don't have to bring in big crates of heavy equipment that would typically be used in a documentary production.
I had to charter a plane, beautiful sunup. We flew straight to Cabin Creek, and wham bam, I'm on my own. There's nobody here. Oh, except for Peter.
In my mind, the Frank is a place that for thousands of years people have come to. It's a place to visit, but I don't think it's really a place to stay.
Some people like room service in the hotels. Some people like to wake up to a muddy camp. But it's all personal choice, right?
Big Creek joins up with the Middle Fork of the Salmon. That began our ascent into the Bighorn Crags. 11 miles, gaining over 5,000 vertical feet.
Cameras can't do justice for how steep it is.
So Jeff, whose idea was this?
Peter, I'm not sure, but somehow you talked me into it.
We gonna make it to the top, Jeff?
Yes.
Good.
We will.
Walking along Fishfin Ridge, and as you can see, this is a pretty good drop off the side, but it is a absolutely fabulous view. These trails weren't just created 5 years ago, but in many cases these were the same trails that native peoples used, also the miners and the ranchers of this backcountry area. But the hard work of the Forest Service and the partnering organizations such as the SCA and the Selway Bitterroot Frank Church Foundation, those people do amazing work keeping the basic infrastructure of this wilderness area ready and usable to the general public.
Snow. I ski. What's a little snow with a backpack on, right? But the problem is, if you slid, you wouldn't stop for a couple hundred yards and it would be the bottom of a scree field with your backpack and probably a couple of broken legs.
Mosquitoes were probably another hazard in a nominal kind of way, probably more of an extreme nuisance. When I first came through the woods and saw Ship Island Lake, it just took my breath away.
Incredible, Jeff. That's not a bad view, Peter.
This is the crown jewel of the Bighorn Crags. I think this is the personality of the Idaho backcountry. You never know what you're going to expect, but it is beautiful.
The Frank is an important piece in the network of wilderness areas in our country. You visit, you learn, you test yourself, and then I think the spirit of the Frank is to leave it and leave it the way that you found it.
Should wilderness be preserved? Should there be places? Definitely, there should be places. You need to come back and just listen to the quiet and learn what you're all about. Leaving this, you leave a little bit of yourself, but you also gain a little bit from the land around. That's why people love this area.
When it comes to wilderness, no place in Idaho has been more contentious for more years than the Boulder and White Cloud Mountains. Like the Sawtooth Range 20 miles away, the Boulder White Clouds are part of the Sawtooth National Recreation Area. But unlike the Sawtooths, which received wilderness status in 1972, the fate of this 500,000 acres has been, well, complicated. Back in the 1970s, it was enough to have saved this area from a 600-foot-deep open-pit molybdenum mine near iconic Castle Peak, the area's largest mountain. Since then, one of the last, largest, unprotected roadless landscapes in the lower 48 states has remained an area of study and controversy. So, is this even worthy of wilderness status? Well, the land can speak for itself. Many recreationists, particularly those favoring motorized vehicle use, argue that current Forest Service management is sufficient protection for this magnificent landscape. Others disagree. They want the ironclad protection that a congressionally mandated wilderness provides. And Republican Congressman Mike Simpson is in that camp.
I think when God takes a vacation, he goes to the Boulder White Clouds. The streams, the lakes, the forests, the mountain peaks are his cathedrals. And you don't desecrate a cathedral, you preserve it.
Along with wilderness, his proposal includes incentives for communities and ranchers to support the plan. And it also reduces trails open to motorized bikes and snowmobiles. But a decade of failed attempts to pass the measure has convinced others that there must be a better way. And that better way, they believe, is a national monument.
One of the benefits of monument status over pure wilderness is you can negotiate the usage plan where you can include more users, whereas wilderness is very strict and it's these groups are in and these groups are out. So being able to designate monument status as opposed to wilderness, it gives you a lot more flexibility, and I think the flexibility is what's key in broadening out land protection.
Baker and others are convinced that national monument status is a better fit for a younger generation of Americans.
I think had mountain biking existed in 1964, we would not see the ban that we see on it now. And I don't think it sends the right message when you have a large group of mountain bikers who want to be able to continue their sport, but also are land preservationists.
In nearby Blaine County, in the bike-friendly towns of Ketchum and Sun Valley, the National Monument concept has many friends.
The world is changing. I mean, we are getting a little bit older, like me. A lot of them can't hike anymore or backpack. And mountain biking is my way of getting out into the mountains. I just think with the advent of the National Monument, it gives us a lot more leeway, it gives us more flexibility, and It creates recreation in our backyard here that we might not have access to otherwise.
On the other end of the white clouds, in rural Custer County, one is hard-pressed to find any supporters of a national monument.
As I stated in the start, this entire proposal is an inappropriate use of the Antiquities Act and is a sham. This is not a public process. Things will not remain the same, and the proposed economic boom to this area is nothing but a gross fabrication.
How many people in here, let's show the hands, are against this national monument? Thank you.
In fact, a November 2014 advisory vote rejected the monument concept by a whopping 90%.
Oh, it's fascinating. Just, you know, I wouldn't say New West, Old West, I'd just say two different Wests, you know. And I think it's the uncertainty over what it all means that gets people concerned. And that's why I've argued, if it ends up going the monument route, get involved in arguing for things that can go in the proclamation. A president can do anything they want in a proclamation. They can't create wilderness, but they can do about everything else.
So what's in store for the Boulder White Clouds? At the Frank Church Conference on Wilderness, Congressman Simpson made this prediction.
I will tell you, though, and I firmly believe this, that next year at this time, at this conference, one of two things will happen. The Boulder White Clouds will be a national monument, or it will be protected wilderness.
Whatever happens, we've seen a serious attempt to look beyond wilderness for an alternative, something that protects the land and speaks to the preferences of a changing demographic. Aldo Leopold, the forest supervisor who helped set aside the first Forest Service wilderness back in 1924, wrote that the richest values of wilderness lie not in the days of Daniel Boone, nor even in the present, but rather in the future.
One of the questions that I ask my students is, what is wilderness? And it's amazing the variety of answers I get. It's solitude, it's nature, it is grizzlies, it's wolves. The ways that people idealize and think about wilderness are vast and extreme, and other people would say it's wasted land. That's certainly what the first Europeans thought of as wilderness. The idea of wilderness has changed over time and has not been the same throughout American history.
The question is, to me, with the younger generation, do they value it as much? Younger people seem to enjoy being outside to a lesser extent, but much more with toys. And their toys include things like mountain bikes. So do they need wilderness to do what they do? I don't get a sense of where that's at right now. I mean, maybe the new generation's going to make us rethink everything again.
There's no question it is part of our heritage, it's part of our culture, and I really do believe it's part of the American spirit. But that's the thing, I want to make sure that wilderness, the concept of wilderness, is relevant 20 years from now, 40 years from now. And I think that's the challenge that we have.
You often hear in the Conservation Services that America's best idea was the national parks. I'll bet you the Wilderness Act's not too far behind that. In years to come, we're going to be recognized as maybe number 2 best idea. Once it's gone, it's gone. You can't get it back, so hold on to it as long as you possibly can.
The author Terry Tempest Williams called the Wilderness Act a way of caring beyond ourselves and beyond our own species. Only 2 other states have more wilderness than Idaho, Alaska and California. If we never added another acre of designated wilderness, Idahoans could still lay claim to having done their part. We have looked into the future, embracing other species as well. We have looked beyond ourselves and even beyond our own time.